Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation here on the Tattooed Historians Facebook and YouTube channels. Thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join us here. And I'm really excited and happy to have Jason Burt on with me this evening. Jason, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you, John?
Good, thank you. Jason is a historian and writer who teaches history in Clarksburg, California. He's also the music producer for the 746 Far East Air Force Band album, which we're going to be talking about this entire hour. The only known full-length album created by a frontline band unit in World War II that was recorded in the field and is garnering support to get the World War II veterans of the 746 a Best Historical Album Grammy nomination and raising money with album sales and streaming for the USO. And I have a copy. I was like, where did I put that copy at? I have a copy of it here, and it's amazing. And I'm very thankful that you sent this to me, Jason. I really appreciate that.
My pleasure. It looks beautiful.
Yes, I love the cover art. It's awesome. And I love the story behind this that we're going to be going over here throughout the hour. And again, I appreciate you being here. Let's start off, Jason, with your background. Where's the love of history come from, and how'd you become an educator?
My love of history really started off when I was probably about in middle school, teenage years. I wasn't so good at the math and the science and stuff, but the history stuff I could kind of pull a C in and kind of get through class, and semi enjoyed that. And I enjoyed listening to my grandpa tell stories about World War II and things like that. And that was kind of my exposure, was listening to my grandpa talk about World War II. And then in high school, at the very high school that I teach at, I had a really great history teacher named Mr. Green, and he brought history to life. And I remember the lesson that really did it for me was one day he said, okay, your homework is to read this chapter. Come to school tomorrow. It's a World War I battlefield chapter. Come to school tomorrow. Be sure you read it. You won't be disappointed. And so I read the chapter that night. I wasn't always a chapter reader. I read the chapter that night. Came up to the door. He numbered us off 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. We entered the classroom, and he had flipped all the desks over into rows to simulate trench warfare. And one side of the class was on the other, and my side was on this side. And we had a big paper ball fight to start the class to simulate World War I. And that's really what kind of got me going, well, this could be fun. It's not just reading stuff in a book. I mean, you could bring this to life.
Right.
And so that really got it in for me. And then somewhere along the way, I got into firefighting and stuff like that for a number of years, and eventually moved over to going back to school, getting my history degree. I think that the history bug was really scratching me for a long, long time too. Mm-hmm. And so eventually got my history degree and my master's degree, and got into teaching, and got back into teaching at my alma mater over here in Clarksburg, California.
That's awesome. How has that experience as a student in the history class impacted how you are as a history teacher?
Quite a bit, because as a student, I mean, I told you I was that C student that could kind of just get by, and history was exciting, but it wasn't like so much so that I would just go do the work. So I can relate to the guys who were in the class and the girls in the class that are the C students, or the ones that just don't like school or just sit in the back, or the ones that are really quiet and don't want to raise their hand and ask questions. I can relate to that. I get that. Mm-hmm. And so it's easier for me to reach those guys and girls in the classroom. And the ones who get A's and B's, they get A's and B's because that's what they do. But the best part of my day is reaching those guys and girls that were like me in class, and getting them to love history like I loved history.
Yeah, I find that a lot of us who were kind of rough around the edges in school can, be good educators in different ways. We can reach the students that maybe some others can't.
Yeah, it's interesting how that works. Like if you would have asked me in middle school if I'd be teaching history or teaching anything at the school I'm sitting in getting C's and only passing PE with an A, I would have told you you're crazy.
Yeah. I enjoyed playing basketball more than going to history class, and now look at us.
Yeah, here we are.
Here we are doing this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But when did you first start hearing about your grandfather's experience during the Second World War?
So he would tell us stories, and I don't remember them. He told stories all the time. He told the same stories all the time about the war. I don't know that I started tuning in until I was about in high school. Okay. And he would tell story. I remember I told you about Mr. Green, and Mr. Green was talking about World War II one day after this World War I lesson. And I was like, oh, Grandpa was in World War II, but I can't remember what he did. And so I remember the next time I saw Grandpa, I was so excited. I just had to focus and like, what did Grandpa do in the war again? And he told me, he started telling all the band stories and stuff like that. Trumpet player, of course, he's a music teacher after the war, so I knew that about him too. But I can remember being just thoroughly disappointed when he was telling me this story when I was in high school, because aside from him being in the band, I was just, when you're in high school, you're hoping for like a grandpa that got like the Medal of Honor for doing something crazy or something like that. Right. And my grandpa was in the band. At the same time, I was a European history or European theater guy back then, not a Pacific guy back then. Right. And so I was a little deflated the first couple of times he told the story. But I think it was in 2003, 2004. He had put something on a CD for me, and it was the first two songs on this album, the Moonlight in Vermont and Trumpet Rhapsody. And I had heard my grandpa play. He was a Juilliard trained trumpet player and a music teacher. And I'd heard him play his trumpet all my life. Like he just played it down the hall. And when you hear that stuff every day, you're just like, oh, that's just grandpa playing his trumpet. That's what everybody's grandpa sounds like when they play the trumpet. And so he gave me this CD, and it was a compendium of just all of his musical recordings throughout his life. And the first two tracks on there were these two from his Army Air Force band that he was had big solos on, and also the oral history that's also on this album was on that CD. And he gave it to me one day, and I was like, oh, okay, I'll check this out. And so I got in my 91 Cutlass Supreme and went for a drive and slid it in the CD player. Nice. And Moonlight in Vermont came on after he introduces the songs, and the first part of the song is his solo. And I remember I had to pull over, and because the solo was just like, oh my gosh, this is my grandpa, because he's 20 years old at this time when he's playing this. And I was just like, holy crap, this is grandpa. Like he's got 20-year-old lungs. I've only heard him from 60 and beyond. And so I was just all in after that. I was like, holy cow, this is his song. And I just listened to the oral history track and that he recorded back in 84, but I'd never actually heard the track. And I was like, oh, they did this, they did that. This is amazing. And my appreciation just pretty much grew after that.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting from an oral history standpoint, where some people are lucky enough to have met their grandparents or great grandparents, whoever it may be, who served during the war or were alive during the war. They may have an oral history of them, but this is a musical oral history, which is, to me, totally different, because you can pick out your grandfather at work on the album.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. You could always, he's the lead trumpet player, and I could always hear him playing the notes. And even when he's playing those notes, I mean, it sounds better than it did when he was grandpa playing his trumpet down the hall. But I can still tell, it's like almost like a DNA in the hearing. Like I have that genetic component of music with me that I can go, oh yeah, that is him. He does this, and he still does this when he's 65. So yeah, no, it is very different in that sense too. Yeah, you're right.
It's like a fingerprint.
Yeah.
He has a style that goes over with him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's awesome, because I know that my grandfather was in the band during the Korean War, and after the war, he just stopped playing altogether. So it's really cool that your grandfather kept going.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, he knew. I mean, even before we came on here, I was telling you, he couldn't even read. He didn't graduate from high school, but he knew his way around the trumpet, around reading music and stuff like that. And he knew music was going to be his life. Even when he was overseas, he would, and the guys had downtime. They weren't playing a show. They weren't doing their practice. They would play pinochle and things like that. My grandpa would go off into the jungle in the Philippines while the war was still going on at night. And he'd go off there with his mute, and he'd go play in the dark by himself and get his extra 3 hours of practicing, because he knew that's what he was going to do his whole life.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. What else do you know of his service in the Pacific? Do you know of when he joined the Army and
oh yeah,
the band and everything?
So he got in April of 43, is when he got in, and he would have been 19 at that time. And he started off over at Salt Lake City at Fort Douglas in Utah. That's where he got processed. And then he got sent to basic training at a place called Camp Kearns, which was kind of also a big musical place. There's a lot of people that stopped by there they're pretty famous. Kay Kaiser was pretty big over there during the war.
Okay.
And so he was over there, and he was slated to go. Well, as he tells it, he was slated for two things. He was either going to be a latrine technician or an Air Corps medic, one or the other.
Nice.
Neither of which, knowing him personally, he would have done well with. But so that's what he was going to do. But he was at Camp Kearns, and he was a Utah guy, and most of the guys there were Utah guys, especially in the band on site.
Okay.
And one of the sergeants in the band, he knew from his schooling, a guy named Max Dalby. And so Dalby saw him over at Camp Kearns during basic training early on, and said, "Hey, give me your serial number." And my grandpa gave it to him. And after basic training, a bunch of his unit got shipped off to go do that latrine technician thing or Air Corps medic stuff. And he got held back. And Max Dalby, he's a pretty big name in the music field over in Utah too. Max Dalby had basically saved my grandpa from doing something he wouldn't have been very good at in the Army. He would have had a miserable Army experience if it wasn't for Max Dalby. But Dalby basically got him in the band, and that's how he got in the band. And then he was transferred from Kearns after a few weeks down to March Field over in Riverside, California.
Oh yeah, I know where that was. Yeah.
So, and he was in Riverside for probably about a year, and that was like the biggest musical education he got in his life was going down to March Field, because the way he describes it is March Field was comprised of 75% of them were professionals in like either the nationally known swing bands or they were Hollywood recording studio musicians who did stuff for the movie pictures. 75% of these guys. And my grandpa was really good. Like I told you, he went to Juilliard and stuff. He was a natural talent and stuff. And he played first chair everywhere he went. But he goes down to March Field, and he's not even second chair. He's third chair because he's behind all these 30-something, 40-something-year-old veteran musicians who play professionally. And so he's at March Field just soaking it all in from these guys and improving his playing register and just becoming a better trumpet player. And he winds up going from March Field in 1944. They had gotten a call to March Field. They were forming a new band, and they needed a trumpet player, but they needed a sergeant. And all of the guys at March Field that were sergeants were married, and my grandpa was not, but he was a private. And so my grandpa went over into the chief warrant officer's office. The chief warrant officer was like a big World War I guy from Pershing Zone. Like he was a big, well-known guy. Yeah. So he goes over into that guy's office and says, "Hey, all these guys are married that are sergeants. Let them stay home. I'll go in their place." And so the CO said, "Yeah, we could do that for you." And so my grandpa basically volunteered to go to the Pacific. Well, he didn't know where he was going, but he volunteered to go wherever they were telling him to go play. He knew it would be overseas, and they didn't actually know where they were going until they got there. Like he describes them getting on the ship and going across the Pacific and doing all these things with the guys on the boat when they cross the equator and all those games they do along the way, and having submarine scares and things like that. Yep. And they didn't even know they were going to the Philippines until they were basically there. They were in Leyte, was their first stop, and that's where they saw a lot of action as far as playing on the front line and having shooting breaking out behind them while they were doing shows with the USO and things like that. And so that was probably the most tumultuous time of the war for them, was being on Leyte during the war. Yeah. But yeah, so he was in the Philippines after that, and they were in the Philippines until like 1945, basically when it was time to go home. Right. And they spent the majority of their time in the Philippines and different islands.
This is one of those guys who is lucky enough that he volunteered for something that didn't get him like in worse shape. Because he never volunteer for anything. And it's like he volunteers and he's like, okay, that's not a bad gig.
Yeah, you picture those guys, they're all standing in line doing dress right dress. And they say, "Who wants to do this?" And everybody takes a step back. And
Yeah.
my grandpa's the one that stepped forward.
Yeah, because I remember my grandfather told me a story of they needed volunteers. They said they needed people who could play the piano for the officers club. And they're like, who here can play the piano? And like 4 guys raised their hand, and they're like, all right, you, and you guys come with me. And they ended up carrying the piano from one building to another. And they didn't get to play it anyway. They just needed people to carry it. So it's like, don't volunteer. This is what happens when you volunteer.
Yeah. So he volunteered. So I mean, some of those guys, if you look back at a lot of the musicians' stories from World War II, a lot of the guys who later they weren't known during World War II as great musicians. They were just everyday guys then, but they'd go on to have big name careers. Like a lot of it was just right place at the right time. Like Dave Brubach, you know who Dave Brubach is, right? The jazz.
Yeah.
So Brubach was he was a sharpshooter. Like he was a really good soldier, and he was all poised to go to the front lines and everything. And he was at I can't remember what it was, but he was somewhere over in Europe, and they needed entertainment for a colonel or something like that, how the story goes, and for a show. And he ends up playing the piano, and this colonel's like, nope, you're not going. He was slated to go out the next day, I think it was. And he's like, no, you're going to form a band here. And he ends up forming his band in Europe, and his career just takes off after that. So yeah, a lot of right place at the right time for a lot of these guys that would become famous later as musicians.
Yeah, it's crazy. That's crazy. How did your grandfather get a recording done?
How did
for the band that later becomes this? But how did he get those first 78s done?
So the original recordings were on wire. That's how they did it over there. So they were getting ready to go home, and they wanted to perform together. And then they had this random opportunity, like their frontline unit, the place they were staying at outside Manila, they happened to have a couple special service guys from a special service unit come through with a wire recorder, and just pure luck. And they were going to be there for a day or something like that. And they were like, yeah, let's see if we can lay something down as a group and just kind of do it for fun or whatever. Not knowing that this would be like something really unique, especially if you held on to it.
Right.
And so they had limited equipment in the sleeve of the records that my grandpa kept in him. He describes how it was made and the kind of equipment they had. Like all they had was a microphone that was meant for just a singer. So it wasn't made to pick up all the noise from all the other instruments and things like that. And they tied that to a pole in the middle of their performance tent. And the one part of the wire recorder was right there to record them. And that ran all the way across the compound to another tent where these special service guys were operating the actual wire recorder and stuff. And so you think about it, it's like, man, all this stuff had to happen for this to get recorded. But
yeah. So
they ended up playing a set, and a lot of the versions of these popular big band songs that are on there were composed by it's their versions of it. Like the guys in the band made their own versions of those songs. So it's a pretty special album. And so anyway, they record this, and my grandpa goes up to the CO after. I mean, they just did it for fun. They didn't know what was going to go on with this stuff. And so my grandpa was like, hey, can I have those? And the CO was like, yeah, sure, go ahead. And one of the things my grandpa did throughout his life that was really, really good was he was definitely a historian, and he thought like a historian. He probably had no idea this would get into the thing that it's gotten into, but he knew it'd be important, and he wanted to share it with his family. That was kind of his thing. Like he'd record his history for his family. And so he brought the recordings home and took them to KSL radio over in Salt Lake City when he got home, and they put him on some 78s for him. And basically he had them for 75 years up until he died. And then we came across them at one point after my grandma had passed away a couple years ago. Wow. And they were just in the sleeve and everything and all there.
Yeah. What was it like finding them?
I had mixed feelings about it. And I sat on them for a while. So I found them, and it's not like I didn't have a record player at the time, but I found them, and I found myself being kind of down, because I was pretty close to my grandpa. I found myself being kind of down, and I was, I've got his trumpet. I'll just stick him up there next to his trumpet. I mean, I've got all these musical things of his, but I'm the guy in the family that doesn't play anything. That's just how close we were. Like everyone knows we were close, but I can't play his instrument. I can't do anything like that. So they just sat up there in my closet for a while I was figuring out what to do with them. And then COVID happened, and so we all had a lot of time on our hands. And one day when my wife and kids were out of the house, I was like, I'm going to pull those down and see if they work or see what they sound like. And I had borrowed a record player from my buddy down the street that I work with here at the school is a vinyl junkie. And so I borrowed one from him and I put them on. And to my surprise, I didn't know how they're going to sound, but to my surprise, they worked really, really good. And I thought, this is pretty awesome. I mean, you sit there and you can close your eyes, and we were talking about the vinyl sounds that are still with the album or still with the music on this CD.
Right.
But you close your eyes and you can kind of put yourself as being in Manila, sitting outside in Manila at one of his shows. And that's kind of what I did. And it was kind of like my own private concert. And you could just like kind of like feel a presence. I don't know. You've gone to history sites and the battlefields over there in Pennsylvania. When you go there, you kind of like, you get this vibe is almost like something happened here. You can feel like, I don't know, it's just a feeling. At least it happens to me. I don't know if it happens to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was just that feeling. It's just like, man, it's almost like I'm there kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so it was pretty amazing to have that experience with my grandpa, even though he's passed away for 3 years at that point. So it was awesome. It was an amazing feeling.
Yeah, that's amazing. What was the catalyst for saying, I want to get this digitized in the modern sense on a CD and in other ways digitally?
I'd always wanted to do something in the history field. Ever since I was in high school, I'd always wanted to write a book about history, or I always wanted to do something. And it turns out, I mean, this was doing something for me, but this was really cool because it was something I could do for my grandpa and his bandmates. I mean, these guys were really, really good. And a lot of them stayed in music after the war. The CEO owned a music shop and played with some big band leaders that are well known in their twilight years. And so a lot of them were still in music after the war, but they never had that professional music career per se. And I was like, this is something I could do for them and see, maybe we can just get it on the shelf at like the World War II Museum or something. That was my initial goal, was like, it'd be pretty cool if we get something for these guys on the shelf at the World War II Museum. And so that's how it all kind of started, just to be able to get their music out there on a shelf somewhere where World War II buffs could be like, hey, that's kind of cool. I'll check this out. Mm-hmm. But the scope of it from that point on, from the beginning, I mean, like I had no idea about liner notes or anything back then, or what it would all entail. And my initial email was with the World War II Museum. I was like, hey, is this something you guys would be interested in? I don't know how common this would be or anything like that. And they emailed back and said, yeah, that sounds interesting. And we've never heard of anything like that. And so from there, it kind of evolved into, well, what else could I do? And I started talking to people in the jazz industry, guys who had jazz podcasts and stuff like that. And they'd never heard of anything like this before. And it was pretty unique, and nobody had ever done it. And one of the jazz guys that was a big proponent of the project, when I did his jazz podcast and we were just talking about it, he was just like, this could really get a best historical album nomination. And at that point I was just like, really? I mean, I could see that being really historical and pretty unique, but I mean, nobody knows who I am. So from that point on, I was like, let's go for this. That would be really cool if we could get some attention on this and see if we can get these World War II veterans a best historical album nomination in the process. And so it kind of evolved into this way of shedding some light on their war experience, their music and stuff like that. And somewhere down the road, it also turned into reuniting them with the USO, because it's mentioned on the album too. One of their first shows ended up being a frontline show, and they were performing with the USO. So they did some shows with the USO, and I thought it'd be really cool to bring that relationship back together and have some of the album sales go to the USO. And eventually we struck up a partnership, the USO and I, and a portion of album sales will go to them. And so these guys, with their music that they recorded back in 1945, can do some good with the USO again.
Yeah, that's amazing. It comes full circle, right? It's like, wow, that's awesome that they get to do that. And they have the chance to have a historical album Grammy nomination. And it's like, that's just another step. It's like, wow, I've never heard of that. And that's really amazing in itself, is that there's a chance.
Yeah. No, there's definitely a chance. And when you look at the stuff that comes out, Like at first I was skeptical because I was like, oh, it has vinyl stuff sounds in the background. I don't know how big anyone's going to be like, oh, it's not clean, so we'll just skip it over.
Mhm.
But a lot of the stuff that gets dominated, at least like every year, there's at least one or two that are just so older than this recording, where most of it sounds like vinyl. It's just a really old recording that's historic. And I was like, well,
Right.
that was kind of when it clicked into my head that maybe this is a possibility. People like World War II veterans. They put stuff on there that have vinyl clicky sounds already. And
Right.
this is a pretty historic thing. So maybe this could happen.
Yeah. And I know that one of the documentary companies that I get to be a talking head on and stuff, they were talking to me about World War II stuff. And they said that they can get World War II stuff funded for these different outlets quicker than any other time period. So people are really eating this up. They want this era now more than ever. And we're here on the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor doing this live stream. And I've heard more about Pearl Harbor today than I have heard in the last 5 years at least. So there's a lot of people who are really getting into this.
Yeah, absolutely. You know who the most skeptical people of this, it wasn't the history people or the people who love military veterans or things like that. It was the people in the jazz community were like, it's got scratches. I don't know how many people are going to, because a lot of people stream music today. And they're like, well, I don't know how well received it'll be because people hear scratchy stuff on like Spotify and they're like, next song, click. And you don't get that 30 seconds of that you need to get that an official listen. But the band's album at its peak, I mean, I tracked down people so much. Like every night I was just like, oh, got to find out who this person's email, find this person who did this playlist. Mm-hmm. And I eventually at its peak, I got this up to 26,000 monthly listeners of the band's album, which is just incredible. Wow. I mean, modern jazz albums don't really do that right now, but this album recorded in a tent in 1945 got 26,000 monthly listeners at one time. It passed up at one point. They were neck and neck. Like one day I was ahead of them with monthly listeners. Not Glenn Miller, the solo artist back home, but Glenn Miller and the Army Air Force Band. They get about 25,000 monthly listeners, and for like it was probably like 2 or 3 days, where the 746 Far East Air Force Band just barely passed them up.
Edge them out. There you go.
So I got Grandpa over Glenn Miller for about 3 days.
There you go. There's a good thing for Grandpa to notch up for him. Great historian in the chat, Jared Frederick. I love this project. Will the album possibly be available on some sort of commemorative edition CD with a photo history insert booklet? Jared, here's part of your answer. I have one right here. So we have the CD encased, ready to rock and roll. Tell us about the CD compilation, Jason, and other than the digitized digital version, what about the CD hard copy version?
Yeah, so initially it was released as a digital. It's on iTunes and stuff like that, and it was on all the streaming sites. And the reason that was because, you know, this is a history project, and at its core, it needs to be done right. It needs to be researched, and you got to find something unique about it. And so the whole process of actually coming up with an idea for the CDs took me a while. And the CDs will have an official release date. I got to do it in like January for the distributor. Mm-hmm. But I do have extra copies, so if people email me, I can get them stuff early if they want and send them out. But the CDs came around, and they took a lot of thought. If you hold up you want to hold that up again, John?
Yeah.
So the cover, that is my grandpa's trumpet. It's got Manila 1945 under there, and that is my grandpa's Army serial number. That's just the tip of the cap to my grandpa. But nice. So the background of that is my grandpa's footlocker that he brought the album in, that he brought the recordings home in. And on the back, it's that same. Let
me see if I can get the glare off of it.
Yeah, those are the records that we pulled the recordings from, and they're also on my grandpa's truck. So that's like a cover to cover. And the inside of this, you'll find 20 pages of liner notes from different historians. And it basically tells the story my grandpa tells of his time in the Army Air Force. So it starts off with him at Camp Kearns, and it's got a little blurb there from the historian at Camp Kearns. My grandpa's on every single page with a quote from him that kind of tells his story. And historian, the 746 story.
Yeah.
And it's paired with a World War II black and white. And underneath my grandpa's quote on every page is a quote from either a historian or there's three military historians on it. I mean, they were in the military bands, but they're unit historians. And one is a really cool guy named Colonel Tim Holton. He's got a great story in there too about his dad, who was a trumpet player in World War II. So a lot of great input from there from different musical people. Dennis Sprague is in there. He's the head of the Glenn Miller Archives in Colorado. John Lucas is in there. David Sussman is big in the music history business, and James Zobel over at the MacArthur Memorial. So there's a lot of stuff in there, and they kind of elaborate. So my grandpa tells the story of his story in his quotes and the band story. And then on each of those pages, one of those historians elaborates on that in kind of the broader sense of the war. So it really turned out really good.
Yeah, it's really awesome. There's a lot of good information in the booklet itself. For a small booklet, there's a lot of great information in here.
Yeah.
And as historians can only do so much in a small limited space, but it gets it whets that appetite, right? To be like, oh, I need to know more about this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. And there's always, there's stuff in there that'll surprise you. I mean, Colonel Tim Holton's story was so great. Like, I loved his story. He's talking about his dad. His dad was a trumpet player like my grandpa, and he was in the AmeriCal division, and they were on their way to Guadalcanal. And I want to get his quote just right. So this is Colonel Tim Holton talking about his dad, and he says, on the way to the Pacific Theater, World War II, there were many unknowns for soldiers with no combat experience, and military bandsmen were no exception. However, military leadership would do their best to prepare troops for the coming events, sometimes in a humorous manner. In one such moment, Private Orville Holton, that's Tim's dad, of the 164th Infantry Regiment, recalled that while the regiment was en route to Guadalcanal, they were visited by Admiral Bull Halsey. When the admiral came upon his group, he asked what unit they were. The men duly informed Admiral Halsey that they were the band of the 164th. Asked if they brought their instruments, the band replied that they had not. The admiral's response left the band with little to imagination about their future, as he stated, "Good, you won't be needing them."
That sounds like Halsey.
Yeah, yeah, he's kind of. I like his. He's an interesting guy. The other thing about the album that I want to do was kind of keep to the integrity of where they came from. So that picture of, I can hold my end up. That picture that John was showing, that you were showing on the back, John, of the actual records. So when it came to do the artwork of the actual CD, I wanted it to look exactly like those vinyls, and they came pretty close. It looks pretty much like that. And it says the same stuff on there. And so the actual CD looks like the vinyl. Yeah. And then the album actually comes with, when you flip it open after the CD, it comes with a DVD that looks like a film canister. And a film canister was also brought home by my grandpa. And so you get a DVD of the band actually playing their instruments out in the Pacific and goofing around with that, the way soldiers do when they're out at war, and just pounding around with each other. So there's about 9 minutes of footage with the band out in the Pacific, kind of doing their thing and playing their instruments and all that fun stuff.
That was one of the strengths of this too that I really liked, is you get it in multiple multimedia formats. You can get you get to hear the stuff, but then you get to see it, and I think obviously you get to read the history too. That's just fantastic.
Yeah, having the visual is really, really cool too. I was so glad he kept that stuff.
Yeah, and you know that from teaching in the classroom, some people learn by watching it, some people learn by hearing it.
Yeah,
some people learn by reading.
There's so many different mediums to get the band to get their music and who they were and their story out, and it was a really cool project to work on.
The Solitary Historian. Has anyone ever done a book detailing their existence and experiences? I reckon she means a larger scale book than just what's in the CD itself. Is there any maybe a possibility of that in the future, or anything that was done on their experiences previously?
No, not yet. So I'm actually working on that right now, and I'm starting with, I mentioned earlier, one of my things when I was younger was I wanted to write a book, and I absolutely want to. I mean, there's enough material here and to write a big book like the kinds of books you see over at Barnes and Noble. But at the current point in time, I'm working on a manuscript for a publisher, but it's not for a very large scale book. It's more of like a book that's about 30 pages for a story that kind of goes through here, and it's got a little. It's kind of similar. It's along the same vein as if you've seen Christmas. What is that called? Is it called Christmas from Heaven? The one with about the candy bomber.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of along the same wavelength that Tom Brokaw did with that.
Right.
Kind of as far as how long it is and things like that.
Right.
And having an uplifting message behind it, kind of thing. And I wanted to start that way, mainly one because I haven't written. I mean, if you're gonna write a full-on book, you should probably have a practice round first. So I figured I'd do that with something that was more like 30 to 35 pages first, because I love writing, but I've never taken on a whole big project like that before. And the other reason I did that first was if I could write a big book like that, but none of my students would read something like that. But at least not at their age and in the classroom and stuff. I mean, they might go check it out just because my name would have been on it, but I could really see them reading something that was about 30 pages and reading it over and over and over again. So part of me wanted to do that first for those guys, for the kids in my classroom too. Yeah.
Have you exposed them to these recordings in the classroom?
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, they actually, every semester I incorporate it now when we get to the end and there's some time we do some World War II. And every semester since the album's been out, I have them do an album review as if they were like reviewing a jazz album. So I give them an example. And this came out around the same time as that Disney movie last year. I think it's called Soul. And Soul had a really good soundtrack and has a lot of album reviews, and they're all into that, the Disney Plus and stuff. And so I give them an example of an album review that was pretty basic for Soul. And I say, listen to this album all the way through and kind of like do the format that they do it in. And what do you like? What do you not like? What do you notice about it? What do you notice about the oral history part and all that kind of stuff? So yeah, they do get exposed to it quite a bit at the end of the semester, and they love it. They think it's really cool.
That's awesome. That's awesome. The thing that we talked about before we went live that I really want to touch on is the sound. And you talked about it, the logistical thing that this was to undertake on the island. There's just one mic and wires going from one tent to another and getting this all done. It had to be an extravagant process to get this done, as far as having things lined up and everything. When you have the final product on CD, the thing that I really liked was you still have the sound of the vinyl. And I think that's really going to pop for a lot of people, because we're getting this resurgence of vinyl now in popular culture. How has the review of that been? Have you had some people who are like, I don't know if that's going to work? Have you had people who are like, this is amazing, this is great that this is left in? What has that response been like?
The majority of people say that they like it. Like they love that. And especially, so the majority of people say, oh, they love it. And then there's a middle of the road person who goes, well, I guess this is okay. But then they hear the context of the story and where it was made, and they go, oh, okay. And then it makes more sense to them why it sounds like it sounds, and it's why it's unique and things like that. And then it makes it special to them once they hear the context of the story. And then there's always a portion that's probably like 1 in 10 that's just like you were never going to turn them into anything anyway, because they're just like, oh, it doesn't sound clean, get it out of my earbuds. Right. So
they'll be satisfied anyway.
yeah, even with the context of where it was made and things like that. And it's usually the younger crowd that's like the teenagers and the 20-something, because even some of my students, when they first hear it, before they know it was made in a tent or anything, before I tell them what it is, they're just kind of like, you could see them going, what is this? What is this noise? Mm-hmm. All I've ever heard is like actual music with no pops in my earbuds and stuff like that. But yeah, no, it's mixed reviews, but it's pretty much all positive. Everybody loves it once they hear the context, especially.
Right. I think it's very important for people to realize that context, in that before they even listen to it, to understand that this isn't Glenn Miller in a studio. This is the Philippine Islands in a tent with one microphone. And I know how hard it is to do a live event with one microphone in the 21st century. Imagine what it's like in 1945.
Oh yeah.
And then you're outside doing it, and it's like, yeah,
crazy. Yeah, the funny thing, my grandpa goes into pretty good detail in the oral history about how they made it and stuff. And it's like, oh, it was pretty casual. The flaps were up. Like there were some Filipinos that were hanging out there, and some of the guys from the units were just kind of hanging out, listening and stuff. And so it was like it was a private jam session, but like it was open to people to walk by and check out and stuff like that. There's even one track, and there's a couple things that bothered me on a personal level about the album once I heard it back. And one of them is, and this is more of a technology thing, that it was just on one of the tracks, Trumpet Rhapsody on the end and the beginning of Perdido. They stop playing and you can hear them talking. You can tell somebody's talking, but you can't make out what they're saying. And I was like, if only the technology was good enough that I could make out what they were saying. That would have been so cool.
Yeah.
So
I heard that too. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that part I thought was really cool. And I was like, it's too bad you can't make out what they're saying. And the other thing that I kick myself for, it's my fault really, and I should have asked more questions while he was still alive. But I mean, I didn't have access to the records before. Was oh my gosh, the singer of this band has such a nostalgic voice, and he's one of the guys my grandpa does not mention who he is or anything like that, and I have no way of tracking him down so far. And I've researched a lot of the band members and stuff. You can see the known band members are listed and have short bios inside the liner notes. But that was one of my biggest, because man, I love that guy's voice. He does such a great job singing on the albums. But I've tracked down a lot of relatives of the band members that are known, and they're all really so supportive, and they're like, this is fantastic. I had no idea he was even, I mean, we knew he was in the band, but to have his music and stuff, it was like, and it's great talking to them too. I mean, you talk to them and hear more of the story of that band member. Like I just hear bits and pieces from my grandpa. Like, I was friends with this guy. He was really good at this. But when you talk to those people's family members and stuff, and they tell you their version of their relative story, and you can connect it with yours, it's almost like I just inherited like 25 extra grandpas. It's pretty great.
Yeah. You hear that a lot with veterans groups and stuff when they would meet and families would meet, and it's like a whole big family reunion in itself.
Yeah.
How long was the process, Jason, from when you started to get this on hard copy disc, digitized kind of thing, till final product? Really,
some of it was delayed on purpose, because I had a hard set date of wanting to do it for the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. So I wanted to do it somewhere around that time, and at the same time, I wanted it to be released on Veterans Day of that same year. So I had a hard date of that. The actual time it took to do a lot of things, I mean, there was a lot, because of COVID, a lot of stuff got delayed too.
Right.
But initially my first thing was, okay, I've got the album recorded, but what I need is a good sound engineer. And so middle school history teacher me went searching the internet, and I was like, let's look at guys who've won Grammys. I mean, the best historical album Grammy. Let me look at jazz sound engineers that won for jazz, different old fashioned jazz albums and stuff like that. And so I look them up and I go, I wonder how hard it is to get a hold of a guy who's won a Grammy that's a sound engineer. I mean, it's not like I'm trying to track down Beyonce and email Beyonce.
That's right.
And so I started emailing some of these guys, and they started emailing back. And I was like, well, this is surprisingly easy. And so I'd tell them about the album, and I'd tell them what it was and stuff. And they'd say, oh, yeah, that sounds good. Let's work something out. And I forgot how it happened, but at one point I emailed like 3, and all 3 of them got back to me and said, yeah, they were interested. But the third one was down in Burbank, and he had won several Grammys in the best historical category and worked with a lot of big time people. And when I told their assistant what the project was and what it was coming from, like what kind of vinyl was getting pulled from and the backstory, they were the only ones who like picked up the phone and called me and said, hey, let's do this. And the guys are really excited about this. They have to order special equipment for that kind of vinyl to actually pull it off there and this and that. And I mean, I was going to do it with them no matter what, but it made it easier that they were still in California, because there's no way the other guys were in New York and Tennessee, and there's no way I was going to ship. I mean, you break those records and that's that. There's no backups.
Right.
So once I had my sound engineer on board, drove to Burbank with a buddy, 6-hour drive. Those guys were strapped to me in my seatbelt.
Yep.
Not leaving me for anything. And it would have been really cool to watch the guys work on it. down there. They worked on it for basically half a day to get it imported from the vinyl over into an MP3 for them to actually do the actual work.
Mm-hmm.
And so that process was pretty quick. But I was trying to say it would have been cool to watch them, see how they work, and see how guys who are on that level of winning Grammys work as sound engineers. I mean, that interests me too. But because of COVID, I couldn't go inside their little bunker to watch them work or anything like that, which was kind of disappointing. But at the same time, so I got Grammy-winning sound engineers to work on this thing, and I figured that was going to be really hard. And when guys who won Grammys emailed me back and said, "Yeah, let's do this," I was like, "Huh, that was easier than I thought it was going to be."
Yeah,
I think it's just the project and the scope of it, and all the stuff that the backstory and all that kind of things that has to do with the band, and it's World War II guys, and I think that's what pumps people up. And so, to answer your question, it took longer than it should have, I think, because of COVID, but the actual getting the music ready, getting it to ready to release and everything, that didn't take as long as I would have thought. The longer part was definitely the CD and the liner notes, and what kind of artwork are you gonna use? What you got to find photos and things like that. That was definitely the longer part. And I can remember having the same thought in my head when I was like, well, I came up with the idea of what I wanted to do with the liner notes that I mentioned earlier. And I was like, well, who's going to write all these quotes? Like, nobody knows who I am. I'm not going to say the same. I'm not going to comment on every single page. That looks kind of lame. You want to hear it from a variety of people, especially people who are in military bands. Yeah. And so I was at this same issue where I was like, okay, let me find some guys who are relevant, who know what they're talking about, and who would want to work on this. That's got to be pretty hard. Same thing I had with the Grammy guys. I was like, well, what are the odds these people are going to email me back? And so I started looking around, and I was like, this guy would be good for this. I had met John Lucas because of our connection with William Dias. My grandpa played taps for Lieutenant Colonel William Dias before he got moved out to the Philippines. And so I had this connection with John Lucas, and I knew John would do something for me, a short write-up, and he was great enough to do that for me. So there was John, and then I researched all these other guys. There was Dennis Sprague, who's really big with Glenn Miller, and he's written books, and he hosts this national radio show with another guy. Mm-hmm. And the rest was the military band people, like Colonel Tim Holton, Sergeant Kira Wharton, and Adam Lassar. Those are people who are the historians of the President's Own and Pershing's Own, like the big national, the Army and Marine bands. And I was like, well, there's probably some red tape there with those guys too. I was like, so I emailed all these people, and my God, every one of them got back to me and said, yeah, let's do it. And I was like, oh, this is fantastic. Mm-hmm. And so because of all these people and their excitement about what the project was, the uniqueness of it, the rarity of it, they just all hopped on board. They didn't ask me for anything. They just said, yeah, I want to do it. Just tell me what you want. And basically I picked pictures that went well with each quote from my grandpa, and all those guys just wrote up magic. Like, it all looks great.
Yeah. Oh, it's fantastic. The booklet is fantastic. And for people who love history, but love quick history, it's fantastic because, like I said, it's the introductory stuff where it's like, hey, this whets your appetite. This makes you want to learn more about it. And then you're listening to the album at the same time. You're watching the DVD. It really all comes together in that way. And I think it's fantastic. It's just enough, to where it's not getting people into a corner with one thing. There's a little bit of each thing. It's like having history tapas, if you will. You can have just a little bit of history here, a little bit of history there, and go from there.
Yeah. At the same time, that was in the back of my head too, because there was so much I wanted to put in the liner notes, but I was limited to 20 pages. And with the size of the writing and everything. And I was like, I want to say so much more here. But you're right. It's just enough to where someone goes, I want to know more. And that's when in a couple of years, I'll have a big book that'll say more. Yeah. Until then, they can have the music and everything.
Yeah. This is a great hors d'oeuvre for the main course that'll come later.
Definitely.
Where you're like, hey, this could also be used for your introductory for that,
Yeah.
That's fantastic. With the how can people get a hold of the digital copy, and later with the hard copy, Jason? How does that go down? I've placed a link in the comment section for the webpage, but how can people go about getting all this stuff?
So the webpage, if you go to the webpage, I mean, you can look up 746 FEAF Far East Air Force Band in iTunes and Amazon if you want to buy the digital as well. But I will say I can't remember what it costs there, but if you go to you don't get the iTunes and Amazon don't give you the digital copy of the film. But if you buy it off the band website, it sends the digital copy of the music, and it also sends the digital copy of the film that you get with the album. So literally, if you buy it off the band's website, 746 FEAF,
mm-hmm.
You're basically getting the CD without the liner notes. You get the CD, you get the DVD, and all that stuff. And that the portion of that goes to USO, and the other portion goes to funding me getting more CDs to get out to museums and stuff. The actual CDs I'll have available. I mean, if your watchers and listeners want to email me, we can put that in the chat too. I have some on hand. I can send a lot of them some early stuff, and it's just a PayPal payment or anything like that. We can get that squared away.
Yeah.
And I'll ship them out. But the official release will probably be somewhere in January. I'm still figuring out the distribution stuff. And what was the other thing I was going to say? I can't remember. Sometimes you just go a little foggy.
Yeah.
But that's what I was going to say. But so a few of the bigger museums have picked it up. I've got a box sitting next to me that's going out tomorrow to the National World War II Museum. It's going to be on their shelf probably before that January 1st time frame, and closer to you in Norfolk, Virginia. It is also at the MacArthur Memorial Museum.
Oh,
so
fantastic.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Jason, if you have a moment, can you put your email in the private chat, and I'll just copy it right into the our chat here on Facebook, so anyone can email Jason about getting your copy as well. So please contact him for that. I will make sure I can do this properly, because sometimes it acts up, but I want to make sure everything's good to go. So that should work. There we go. Just placed Jason's email into the chat, so if you want to get the hard copy, you can go about contacting him directly for that. I also placed the 746fief.com/store link in the chat, so you all can go directly to the store if you like. And then when you look at the top, you can also see the photos, album reviews, song lists, everything to offer on that website.
Yeah. And then also for people who also stream as well too. I mean, it's on Apple Music and things like that. I pay most attention to Spotify because people with the playlist is just easier for me. So if you're on Spotify, all of that stuff helps the band as far as, I mean, when you go and turn in your application for the Grammys and stuff like that, a lot of the analytics and stuff are pretty big, and we can point and kind of sway voters and say, oh, we have this. I mentioned our monthly listeners. We're up with Glenn Miller's military band earlier.
Right.
But all that kind of stuff is stuff that guys on my team can go point to other voters and say, hey, look, they got 26,000 monthly listeners. That's something you can really hang your hat on. And so if you're on Spotify, hit follow on the band's artist page and add some of their music to whatever playlist you have, or create a World War II playlist or a big band playlist and add some of their music. All that stuff helps the analytics and gets the Spotify algorithm thing to kick it to other people and stuff like that once you start playing it. So if you play it on the Spotify or Apple Music, that helps us as well too.
Yeah, and if you're a World War II interpreter and you like to play this stuff in the field, this is the sound that you want. It sounds just like the vinyl. It's great.
Yeah, I had one guy tell me you should try and get hold of Tom Hanks while they're doing Masters of the Air. They're filming that. They could just have it if they're in a bar or something. It could be like on the record player in the bar. I thought that'd be like the pinnacle.
Yeah, you already got the Grammy people with you. You might as well go for that. I mean, this whole story has proved one of my big points I've often told other people in the history field. If you just email people and ask, the worst they can say is no. you know, just find out.
Yeah, I get a feeling. I mean, I've had better luck than I thought I would just emailing all these great guys in the history field and the Grammy-winning sound engineers. But I think my luck would probably run out if I tried to email Tom Hanks. I'm pretty sure I would not hear back.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll have to,
Who knows? You never know, though.
We'll have to find a sound person that works on set. Maybe we can do that
Something
way.
like that. That's
Go in
true.
a side door, Jason. Go in a side door. But no, this album is fantastic. Thank you for sending me this one, Jason. It really means a lot to me.
My pleasure.
And I'm going to gift this to my grandfather because he served in the band, one of the bands in the Korean War, and I know he'll probably remember some of the songs himself, and he can reminisce about that stuff. But I know that everyone in the chat has been given all the sites and Jason's email in case you want to get your copy of this. If you're in the New Orleans area or the Norfolk area.
Norfolk, yeah.
Yeah, you'll be able to get it here in the new year at some point when you go visit those areas. Go to the National World War II Museum and MacArthur and go check that out there. Jason, thank you so much for sharing this history with all of us. I mean, it's amazing that you get to do this, and I'm so glad that it's come to fruition.
Thank you so much for having me on. I pinch myself every day that we're both doing this kind of stuff. I mean, it's a blessing to be able to do this kind of stuff.
It is. I never thought I'd be doing what I'm doing, and it's just like I was a C student in history too. So here we are. Here we are doing our thing. But again, thank you everyone for joining Jason and I this evening here on Facebook and YouTube. Please go check out the website. Go support this project. It's an amazing one. Who knows? It may be a Grammy Award-winning one here before we know it. You never know. Keep your fingers and toes crossed, my friend. Hope you all have a fantastic evening. Please be safe. Take care of yourselves. We'll be chatting with you very soon, everyone. Take care.